different for lots of reasons, and I've been trying to make sense of this through writing the paper and also just sitting there. But I think I probably would start with a very broad statement, which is for the large part of the people that I have worked with do not really, they might benefit from freedom of movement. Very clearly there are benefits to that, but they're not perhaps the people that the freedom of movement was intended for in terms of this kind of development of migrant capitalism that Adrian's been talking about. And I think that provides us with something quite useful to go ahead in terms of thinking. Now the quotation I've presented here comes from fieldwork I carried out in 2004. So Alana had been living in rural France for 3 years with her husband after they took retirement from their jobs in the UK, and they'd taken early retirement, so they're in their late 50s. And yet, I think this sounds as though it could have been written yesterday, 12 years later, when Britain is faced with the opportunity to consider again their membership of the European Union. I start with this quotation to highlight the ambivalence of many of the people that I worked with in France about Europe, despite the freedoms that it gave them in respect to freedom of movement and the right to reside in another European country. But I also state it here to initiate a discussion, a chance to think more deeply about the structural conditions that promote and facilitate British migration to and settlement in European countries, whether Britain is in or out of Europe. So Ricci, who I know that Adrian's worked quite closely with, makes very, very clear in his work on European citizenship this equation between what European citizenship and the privilege of mobility. Privilege in this rendering pivots around free movement for those who are fortunate enough to have citizenship of a European Union country. But what happens if the British public choose to exit the European Union? Will this one act reverse such privileges, and will British nationals find themselves migrants, third country nationals who don't have the benefits of their European counterparts? I'm not really planning to answer these speculative questions, but I think that they're actually quite useful provocations in thinking again about British migration to European countries. To my mind, what becomes clear is that the mobility of the British is enhanced by and not dependent on European Union membership. Simply put, we could consider Europe as a proverbial red herring in relation to considerations of British migration. Their privilege is undoubtedly compounded by European citizenship, but is not dependent on it. And it's with this in mind that I want to start thinking about privilege as a constellation, which includes European citizenship, but is not solely reliant on it. So I'm going to try and talk about some of the other things which I think give these British people the privileges that they have to live in rural France, and the consequence of historical and material conditions that precede the utopian vision of European integration. So this is an argument that's framed through the consideration of the lived experience of what are very, well, relatively affluent migrants, rendering visible and remarkable particularly the intersections of class and coloniality and their claims to belonging. So the research I did was conducted in the Lot, which is a rural inland department in the southwest of France. And as I said, my caveat with this is that this is research that was carried out in 2004, but I'm using it to reflect again on this idea about privilege and migration. So, first of all, I think that before I start to talk about this kind of more constellation approach to understanding privilege, it's important to think about how freedom of movement as an explanatory framework has been used to make sense of British migration to European destinations, and how that might have obscured the location of these movements, particularly for these people who are voluntary movers, who are not moving for work necessarily, but they might be moving for factors that we might more readily conceive of as consumption, so lifestyle, those types of things. And I can go into that in some more detail through questions if you like. But thinking about where these are located within wider global structures, historical and material conditions, and this might include thinking about the relative position of Britain within Europe, drawn from its history, economic position, its location within the geopolitics of Europe, and the resonances of this. But it might also involve reflection on the global position of Britain, drawn its history as a colonial power, and the traces that this leaves, and which are refracted in the contemporary mobilities of its citizens. The spectre of freedom of movement works, in my opinion, to shade these from view, suggesting that the British within Europe are equal to other European citizens. I'm not sure this is accurate. So I remember in 2008 turning on the radio and hearing Theresa May, who I just don't actually have words for how I could describe her, pronouncing that it might be necessary to put in place contingency plans to shut down the freedom of movement of Greek and Spanish citizens who, following their sovereign debt crises, might flock to Britain. She discursively constructed these phantom subjects as migrants who might flood our cities, take our jobs and benefits. I think these are all very, very familiar representations. Somehow, I can't quite imagine a prominent government official of another European country making equivalent statements about their British populations or the threat of a British invasion. Gillian Cross's dystopian children's novel, which I thoroughly recommend to anyone who's got small children who are trying to understand the refugee crisis, this novel, After Tomorrow, depicts a British refugee population on the move, desperate to migrate to Europe to escape crisis-afflicted Britain, food shortages and anarchy, and yet stuck in a camp in Calais. And I think that what's particularly prescient about this is it disturbs the imagination precisely because of the juxtaposition to the lived reality with which the British are currently able to cross the border to France and elsewhere. So, taken as a whole, I suggest that this is telling of the privilege of the British, a privilege that extends beyond freedom of movement. So, what does this relative privilege do, and what does it do in relation to border crossing? Research on mobilities, privileged travel and migration, and lifestyle migration already goes some way toward demonstrating how privilege and migration may intersect, allowing for a discussion that extends beyond the mere recognition of how freedom of movement and the right to reside in another European Union country facilitates intra-European Union migration and movements. And there are several people in this room who've been writing on this for a really long time and whose work I have referred to extensively in my own and have found really useful within that. Central to many of the arguments about the way in which privilege and migration intersect is the recognition of asymmetric distinctions between the locations moved to and from, the cultural, economic and political power of border crossers enhanced through the act of migration. And this stands at odds to what we understand about many other migration flows, which are more likely to be characterised by capital and resource depreciation. To be clear, privilege here is intended not to capture the global elite. These people are certainly not the 1 or perhaps even the 10% who have been the focus of much recent media attention, but the more middle class populations that migrate. Privilege then is intended as a relative statement, reflecting the relationship between sites of emigration and sites of settlement. These voluntary migration flows are as much the product of the global capitalist economy with its roots in colonialism as other contemporary migrations, and yet they're often marginal to migration research, categorised as a case apart through labelling practices, including highlighting these as mobilities, expatriacy, all of those labels that we're familiar with. As Vered Amit stresses, global structures facilitate the voluntary travel and movement of these middle-class people who have appropriate capitals and resources. And I think that one of the works that's come out quite recently that I think is quite useful for thinking through a lot of this is Matthew Hayes' work, where he talks about this concept of geographic arbitrage, demonstrating how those global asymmetries underpin the pursuit of a better way of life for relatively affluent migrants. And he's talking about North Americans moving to Ecuador, but I think that we could usefully transfer that concept over to thinking about Europe more generally. So being able to make good on this promise further rests on citizenship and nationality and demonstrates the continued importance of the nation state. Simply put, those holding the passports of the world's most powerful nation states are able to cross borders with far greater ease than others, even if, in practice, this is further complicated by questions of class, race and ethnicity. So, what I'm trying to communicate here is that such migrations both rest upon and reproduce historical patterns of global inequality, with geographic mobility exacerbating status distinctions. So these are the headlines, really. I don't think that it would take much to convince you that this is what's happening. But I think that we need to think a little bit more, in a little bit more detail, about the production and work of privilege, so that we can understand more in depth about these migrations. And I think what's been really useful for me is shifting my focus from Europe to Central America. So I worked with North Americans who lived in Panama, and I think this has been quite useful in terms of thinking again about how privilege goes unremarked when we're looking at intra-European migrations. Because when you're working in an environment like Central America, working with predominantly white North American populations, I don't think that you can ignore privilege. Privilege is in your face every day, reconfigured in plain view, even through your own life as somebody going to conduct research in that place. The ease with which you cross a border becomes very apparent, and the ease with which your life subsequently is framed becomes very apparent. So working in Latin America, it's become very, very clear to me that the privilege of these migrants is framed through axes that include race, nationality, ethnicity, and gender. It has particular local inflections depending on the particular parts of countries that you're working on, depending on the particular relationships between sending and receiving communities. And yet when we look at British populations in Europe, such privilege does remain largely unrecognised and unremarked. And this might be a flaw of the analytical gaze, a gaze more attuned towards looking towards Europe and the desire to understand the outcomes of European integration, but it is a flaw nevertheless. As my research participants in Law of France make very, very clear, European citizenship is convenient, both facilitating their migration projects, but also in rationalising their presence in the French countryside. At the same time, though, they very, very readily draw attention to the fact that they are British. The national, in this case Britain, remains significant to their identity in ways that being European does not. So this gives an initial flavour to the different layers at which structure interplays with the decision to migrate. The interplay of structure and agency within migration is, as in wider social life, very, very complicated. And this is where I turn to Karen O'Reilly's work on practice theory, where she argues that it's important to incorporate this into our understandings of migration so that we can understand the various macro-level processes, so things like globalization, Europeanization, alongside the negotiations of these structures within individuals' choices to migrate and settle. And she also talks about the ways in which those things become internalized, so she presents quite a phenomenological account, as well as thinking hermeneutically, so looking at how those norms, how those structures become part of conversations between friends, families and communities, as well as thinking about governance. So she's trying to set up a system for understanding very, very complicated relationships between structure and agency. So, this quotation comes from her writing, her thinking again about the British in Spain, and trying to pull together what she calls practice stories, which draws on her own ethnographic work, but also on the work done by people like Russell King and various other people who have actually worked on this for a really long period of time. And she says that by pulling together these different things, we might be able to see those different structural constraints much more clearly. We might be able to see also how people work with them, so that we can see, but we can also see how those structural conditions are transformed through migration into and internalised by the people that are moving themselves. So, I don't want to go into a huge amount of detail with this, and I'm clearly not going to have time to present an entire practice story of British migrants to rural France. But what I want to do is to use this as a way of moving into thinking about a constellation of privilege and what that might look like, and argue that European citizenship might be the current dog star of that constellation, but by moving that, potentially, and I am in no way, shape or form advocating that we should leave the European Union, but just trying to point out that we probably need to think a little bit more about British migrants in terms of these more general historical conditions. So I'm turning back my gaze that has been shifted as a consequence of looking at new work that's coming out on how we might understand migration theory, but also looking at my work from Panama to think again about my own arguments actually about British people in rural France. So I'm just going to describe first a typical story that I came across when I was doing my research that really does set up this kind of ambivalence about being European among the people that I was working with. So Susan, Trevor and I are sitting in a large room that takes up the ground floor of their house. The large kitchen table standing in the middle of the room marks the boundary between the kitchen and the lounge area. It's very cool inside, the thick stone walls of the house impenetrable even in the heat of the summer. We're sitting at the table, cups of coffee and tea in hand, while Susan and Trevor recall their weekly French lesson that they attend at the Association France-Grande-Bretagne in Cahors. They've been asked to fill out a survey, and they're telling me about this to let me know that there's another researcher working in the British in the area. But through this recollection, they begin to talk about their relationship with Europe, fixating on one question that appeared in the survey. Susan reeled off the question. What they were saying was, do you find yourself a European living in Europe, an Englishman living in Europe, or are you trying to become French living in Europe? Or do you just live in an English enclave that happens to be in Europe? This was followed by their adamant statement that they felt the second option, with a small adjustment, best encapsulated how they felt. They were English living in France, which happened to be in Europe. As Trevor explained, he didn't feel he could reply that he was European. Susan continued to stress the importance of being English, highlighting that they had not moved to France because they felt that England had gone to the dogs. They were proud of where they had come from and made a point of not complaining about England. Developing this, Trevor moved on to describe their English relationship to Europe in unambiguous terms. The English have got no affiliation with Europe. We've got this little island attitude, and that's why everybody, other European nations, moan at us. Because we're going to be English associated with the Europeans rather than European. So to put this into some context, they also stressed that each nation in Europe wanted Europe to be run on their terms. It was not the melange of nations all wanting to be one, as in the idealised vision of European integration. So recently I found myself wondering what they'd be saying today, 12 years later, and on the eve of the European Union referendum, and the truth is I really don't know. But what this brief ethnographic vignette highlights is that for Susan and Trevor, as for others who have taken part in the research, being English was more strongly claimed than being European. This tension between affiliating with a post-national social order and a retreat to nationality within claims to belonging writ large. And this came out in various different ways, perhaps not quite so explicitly, among most of the people that I worked with. So there was a couple who had, I think they had 5 children and 2 of them had been born in France, and they were very concerned about whether they should change their nationality so that their children should have French passports, but they didn't really feel themselves that that was appropriate for them in terms of reflecting who they were. Even people who were more left-wing, probably more pro-European Union, more pro-European citizenship, felt a much deeper sense of attachment to the idea that they were British than that they were European. So, and the identity papers that went along with that played a big part of that. So people very much, they would explain their identity through the fact of their British passport, which I think is demonstrates to you how powerful that documentation is for those people. But what became clear is that in claiming their Britishness in the way, it rendered very visible the way in which being European was more rational. They deferred to it when it suited their purposes, but generally they felt that it had very little impact on their lives, other than to justify their prolonged presence in the French countryside. So So they would say things like, well, I can be here because I'm European. But this was a very simplistic and initial, a very shallow interpretation of why they could be there. So admittedly, these accounts date back to 2004 when the EU referendum was not on the horizon at all. And the voices of the British in France and elsewhere might be saying something quite different under the current circumstances. Nevertheless, my aim today is to think beyond European citizenship and into considerations of how privilege is constituted and lived by these migrants. So I think that the use of Europe in these very strategic ways by these people demonstrates that these are rationalizations. And I think that going back to Karen's, the slide with Karen O'Reilly's discussion of the British in Spain and practice stories, understandably, the people that we work with do not necessarily speak of themselves through a discussion of complex structures. This is what we do as sociologists. This is how we make sense of it. So that's what I'm going to try and do here, and I'm clearly only going to be able to focus on a very, very small part of the picture. And so in particular, I'm going to focus on post-colonialism and middle-class formation, because I think this is really, really important towards understanding the British role, and demonstrate the complex underpinnings of British migrant lives in this rural setting. So, first thing I think I would like to point out is the way in which high rates of British migration to France, Spain, and elsewhere in Europe also coincide not only with Europeanisation and European integration projects, but with social and economic transformation in Britain. As my own ethnographic work has demonstrated, recession in the 1990s played a significant role in providing the impetus and conditions to migrate. This was rarely the headline story that people used to explain the decision, but a narrative that I pieced together over my repeated visits and time with them. However, to understand this even further, we need to think back to the expansion of Britain's middle classes post-war, the economic transformations and new opportunities provided by the labour market at this time. It is notable that a significant proportion of the retirees, not everybody was a retiree, but quite a lot of them were retirees, that took part in the study had worked in the public sector, an area of employment that at the time of the research had already gone through significant contraction as the private sector expanded. This explained both the redundancies of many of my research participants, but also the favourable terms on which they were able to leave their jobs and move to rural France. Quite simply, they had quite generous redundancy packages and severance, which really, those packages were foundational in enabling them to make that move. So this one insight opens up the discussion of the complex structures that underpin this migration. However, it's also clear that the story about middle class expansion in Britain, the fragmentation of the middle classes read through the varied possession of different forms of capital, economic, social, cultural capital, resources and assets, is also significant in understanding this migration trend. So this insight that I want to focus on is to do with property investment and ownership. For the most part, moving to rural France meant buying a property in rural France. Owner occupation without a mortgage, the normative tenure among the people I worked with. Undoubtedly, the accumulation of property assets back in Britain played a significant role in making this possible, itself undermined by the significant government agenda and its support to extend home ownership across the populace. The lot, an area that has historically had lower property prices than those departments more popular with the British, for example Provence and Dordogne, was selected in part because of what property was available and affordable, which in itself was the consequence of massive rural depopulation in rural France, of which the lots suffered extremely badly. So there were lots and lots of empty properties available, and combined with the fact that these people had quite significant property assets from the rise of prices and their property ownership in the UK made this possible. So going back to the kind of geographic arbitrage argument that Matthew Hayes presents us with. But another dimension of this is thinking about how class and space intersect and how these might be seen as co-constitutive. Class remade precisely through spatial practices, space enacted upon in ways that inscribe class and race upon it. The genteel vision of the French countryside works wonders in relation to this, because it shields these processes from view. And yet, this is a process of appropriation and claiming ownership, even if it's not accompanied by conflict. As I argue below, just as rural Britain has been described as a post-imperial landscape, where whiteness is socially produced through the inscription of practices of empire onto rural life and landscapes, similar processes are at work in the way that my interlocutors imagine, represent, and conceive of rural France. So, let's have a look at these then. As has been well documented by me and many others, rural France is a veritable rural idyll for British people moving there, replete with community, a slow and sleepy pace of life. Work has been done to demonstrate how rural France, its farming procedures and land distribution make it appear like some kind of ideal type of rural landscape in the British imagination. My own work focused on the landscape on this landscape demonstrates a phenomenological understanding of the relationship between space and migrant identity making. In many ways, the imaginings of rural France evoked correspond to Ray Parl's Village in the Mind, the middle-class valorization of the countryside, a convenient hook on which to hang the decision to migrate, alongside the claim to belonging through European citizenship. I actually lost count of the amount of times that the appeal of the landscape was presented to me as an explanatory frame for migration. Quite often I'd turn up somewhere, they'd throw open their windows and go, well, why are we here? Well, just look out there. But this, I think, highlights the appropriation of that space by its British residents. The prominence of conviviality and community within their accounts of local French populations were also significant. Taken together, both place and those cited within it feed into British middle-class identity formation through claims to authentic living and status discrimination. However, going one step further, it becomes clear that what is missing from these analyses is precisely a consideration of how they refract post-colonial legacies. This is post-colonial understood not solely as wrought through direct relations of colonisation, but rather a more systemic structure, unwittingly internalised and reinscribed. The social production of rural France as a site of white British migration, irrespective of whether these migrants have prior migration histories, speaks to the persistent spectre of colonialism, internalised by the white British subject who takes for granted their right to move within Europe and beyond. As Emma Jackson and I have described elsewhere, the British countryside as a white middle-class space often goes unquestioned, requiring little work by its residents to uphold this space in their image. Similar processes of class and racialised formation are at play in the way that my British participants discursively produce the rural French landscape, inscribing this with precisely the same logic, the same fundamentally post-colonial imaginings that are at work in the construction of the British countryside. Further, the inscription of colonial relations onto European geopolitics is also notable, namely the distinction between Northern and Southern Europe. The depiction of rural France as a backwater, its people as peasants that are frequently evoked through the narratives of British residents, and also, I should also say, by the Dutch people who live there and by the Parisians who move there, speak of centres and peripheries, modernity and tradition, which should be understood in the context of colonial imaginings. Simply put, if we relocate these imaginings beyond the question of Europe, that's so prominent when we think about European citizenship, we can open up a discussion of the wider structures that support this. So, how can this be illustrated? I think that the answer lies in looking again at the discursive construction of these migrants' relationships to the landscape and to the other people living within it. Talking of a part of France that has suffered from widespread depopulation, it's very common to find British residents stressing the contribution that they're making to the local economy, to reviving villages. The naive arguments about how making the outsides of their homes look nice were contributing to the local community. Presenting themselves as contributors, perhaps saviours to local economies that are often dwindling, might be well-meaning. It might speak to the migrants' feelings that they want to be part of something, but these claims are also patronising, conveying a problematic message, we know what's good for you, that echoes the colonialist messages. It's probably timely then to return to thinking about the colonial inflections of nostalgic images of the countryside and community. As Catherine Tyler so aptly demonstrates, these images reflect white middle-class values. They're socially constructed to seem natural, presented as unquestionable. The rural is socially produced as a white landscape. What is different when we look at the British residents of rural France is that the work they're doing to appropriate a space in their own image. Within their own communities of practice, their friends and families back in the United Kingdom, other Britons living locally, their Dutch and Parisian peers, such discursive constructions are uncritically accepted. And yet, the voices that are absent are precisely those of the local French, for whom these discursive practices and their enactment might be more troubling. So, through this presentation, I hope that I've managed to suggest that the spectre of Brexit gives us an opportunity to think again of the privileges held by British people moving within Europe and elsewhere. In particular, I hope I've focused on, very briefly, on how class formation and colonial legacies shape the possibility of migration, but also the migrant experience, and bringing these out into the open in a way that I think is critically important. In closing, I just want to ask you to try to imagine a world where white British middle-class subjects are constructed as the immigrant other. Crossing borders with ease is a normative experience for white British middle-class people, an expectation that is deeply habituated and inscribed on the body. So I find myself questioning whether, with the spectre of the removal of freedom of movement, this will impact in any way, shape or form, or whether the constellation of privilege that these people hold, although somewhat adjusted, may continue, at least for the foreseeable future.